I locked the door myself, double-checking it as I always did. The metallic click of the bolt sliding into place was unmistakable. Yet, as I turned to walk away, a flicker of movement caught my eye. My heart froze. Through the gap in the curtains, something shifted, twisting unnaturally in the dim light. It wasn't just a shadow, it moved with intent, with purpose, as if it knew I was watching. How? The room was supposed to be empty. The storm had been brewing all night, its angry winds rattling the motel's flimsy windows. The neon vacancy sign flickered, erratically, casting brief, jagged shadows across the empty parking lot. I leaned on the counter, counting down the minutes to my shift's end, when a sudden movement on the surveillance monitor snapped me upright. Room 107. A dark blur passed across the screen, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The room was supposed to be locked off limits for weeks due to maintenance issues. I frowned and scanned the monitor again, hoping for a logical explanation. Nothing. Just the grainy view of the empty hallway outside 107. My chest tightened. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out from behind the counter. The corridor stretched long and narrow, bathed in the eerie red glow of the emergency exit signs. The air felt heavy, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the walls. As I approached room 107, my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. When I reached the door, I paused, my hand hovering over the handle. A chill ran down my spine as I peered through the crack in the curtains. There it was again, a faint shadow shifting just beyond the edge of the window. Hello, my voice came out weak, barely more than a whisper. I knocked once, then again, harder this time. No response. My hand gripped the doorknob, but it didn't budge. Locked. Relief and unease warred inside me. If the door was secure, no one could be inside, right? The hallway lights flickered, casting the shadow into sharper focus. It wasn't just standing still, it was moving, twisting, elongating, unnaturally, as though it were aware of my presence. My breath quickened. I backed away, nearly stumbling over my own feet, and hurried back to the front desk. Settling into the chair, I tried to calm my racing thoughts. It must have been a trick of the storm, a shadow from a tree branch. Maybe. But as I glanced at the monitor again, room 107's window stared back, blank and unassuming. My eyes lingered, searching for reassurance. Then, the lights flickered again. And this time, the shadow wasn't alone. Back at the front desk, the phone rang abruptly, the sharp sound cutting through the low hum of the storm. I jumped, my hand shaking as I picked up the receiver. Front desk, I managed, my voice uneven. Static hissed on the other end, crackling like dry leaves underfoot. Then, a voice low, distorted, and wrong whispered, "Don't go." Hey, back to 107. I froze, gripping the phone tightly. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The line went dead. I slammed the phone down, my pulse pounding in my ears. My gaze drifted to the monitor again. Room 107 remained still, but the tension in the air was palpable, like the motel itself was holding its breath. My hand hovered over the logbook, flipping through its pages. I searched for any mention of room 107. Nothing. It hadn't been booked for months. A sudden noise from outside the office pulled me back. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, heading toward the lobby. I rushed out, calling, "Hello? Who's there?" The footsteps stopped abruptly. The hallway was empty. My skin crawled as the storm knocked the power out, plunging the building into darkness. And, in the faint glow of the emergency lights, room 107's door seemed to loom larger than life, a silent sentinel waiting for me to return. The emergency lights cast a dim, reddish glow over the front desk, stretching shadows into monstrous shapes. I sat hunched over the motel's logbook, my fingers trembling as I flipped through brittle, yellowed pages. I needed answers. Room 107, it had to mean something. Then I found it. A thin envelope slipped between the pages, marked only with the room number. My breath hitched as I pulled it out and unfolded the fragile paper inside. Newspaper clippings spilled across the desk, their headlines screaming in bold, black letters. Murder, suicide, shocks, quiet town. My eyes skimmed the words. A couple, traveling cross-country, had checked into room 107 10 years ago. The man had strangled his partner in a jealous rage before hanging himself from the ceiling fan. Staff found them days later. I read the last line aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. Guests report hearing whispers and seeing shadows long after the tragedy. A shiver crawled down my spine, cold and unrelenting. I slammed the envelope shut, as if doing so would silence the words forever. A faint knock echoed from the hallway. It was soft, almost polite, but in the oppressive silence, it was deafening. I froze, staring at the door. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. My legs moved on their own, dragging me toward the sound. Room 107's door stood ajar. I swore I'd seen it locked moments ago. The emergency lights flickered, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw someone standing just inside a dark figure, unmoving, watching. I blinked, and it was gone, but the door creaked open wider. I should have walked away. I should have run. Instead, I stepped closer, gripping the handle. The air grew heavier, colder. My breath fogged in front of me, and the metallic tang of blood filled my nose. Inside, the room was empty, perfectly pristine, untouched yet somehow alive. The curtains swayed gently, though the air was still. My chest tightened as I noticed the faint outline of a handprint on the mirror, pressed from the inside, slowly sliding downward. I stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the door shut. The whispers began again, faint and unintelligible, seeping through the cracks. The whispers didn't stop. They followed me back to the lobby, faint and rhythmic, like a song just beyond recognition. I clutched the desk for support, my head pounding as their volume rose and fell. It wasn't just in the room anymore, it was everywhere. The phone rang again, a jarring sound that pierced the air. I grabbed the receiver. "What do you want?" I shouted. Static crackled, and then the distorted voice came through. "You let it out." My stomach churned. I slammed the phone down, but the line kept ringing, over and over. I unplugged it, yet the shrill noise persisted, filling the room like a scream. Then, abruptly, it stopped. I backed away, trying to breathe, but something brushed against my arm. I spun around, but no one was there, just the lobbies. Empty, suffocating silence. My gaze darted to the surveillance monitor. The hallway outside 107 was pitch black. A single word appeared on the screen, written in foggy letters across the lens sleeve. My body froze, and for a moment, the air itself seemed to stop. Then, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. I ran toward the sound, adrenaline drowning out my fear. Room 107's door stood wide open. The shadows were alive. They swirled and twisted inside the room, taking on grotesque shapes, elongated limbs, faces stretched into silent screams. One shadow broke free, crawling along the wall like a spider. It stopped at the doorframe, and I swear I saw it smile before vanishing into the darkness. I tried to step back, but an invisible force yanked me forward. My feet slid across the carpet as I clawed at the wall, desperate to escape. A cold hand wrapped around my wrist, and I screamed, feeling icy fingers dig into my skin. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the grip released. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The door to room 107 slammed, shut behind me. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, spreading through the motel like a living thing. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a trap, and I was caught inside it. The bruises on my wrists stung as I stumbled back into the lobby, gasping for air. The lights flickered erratically, bathing the room in alternating bursts of brightness and shadow. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone, dialing 911 with clumsy fingers. "Please. Someone has to come," I stammered, but even as the words spilled out, I couldn't explain what had happened. "It's the motel room 107. It's not safe." The operator's calm response felt disconnected from the chaos around me. "They promised to send someone in the morning." Morning? That was hours away. I hung up, my heart pounding. The silence pressed in, heavy and unnatural, broken only by the faint creak of the motel's old ceiling fan. My eyes darted to the surveillance monitor. Room 107's hallway was shrouded in darkness, but something moved, a faint, fluid motion that sent chills crawling up my spine. The shadow wasn't confined to the room anymore. It was spreading, bleeding into the motel itself. A loud crash jolted me. The coffee pot on the counter shattered, shards flying in all directions as if flung by an unseen force. My breath hitched as papers from the desk fluttered into the air, caught in an invisible whirlwind. The phone rang again, its shrill tone slicing through the chaos. I stared at it, paralyzed, but it wouldn't stop. Slowly, I picked up the receiver. Static crackled, followed by the same distorted voice. "You'll never leave," it whispered, low and menacing. "Tar." I slammed the phone down and turned toward the window. The parking lot was empty except for the shadow. It stood at the edge of the flickering neon sign, its form clearer now, humanoid yet grotesque. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze, cold and unrelenting. My knees buckled as it raised an arm, pointing toward the motel entrance. The lights went out completely. In the pitch black, the whispers began again, surrounding me. They weren't just coming from room 107 anymore. They were everywhere. I couldn't run anymore. My legs moved on autopilot, carrying me toward room 107. If I didn't face it now, I knew I wouldn't survive. The night. My flashlight beam trembled as I approached the door, which hung slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of the darkness inside. I pushed it open. The room was unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. The air was thick, and my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and shift on their own. At first, it looked empty. But then, the shadow emerged, peeling itself from the wall like liquid smoke. It solidified, taking on a grotesque, half-human form, its face twisted and incomplete, as if it were struggling to hold its shape. "You've been chosen," it rasped, its voice scraping against my mind like nails on a chalkboard. "Fear feeds us." It moved closer, its presence suffocating. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. It didn't walk, it glided, growing larger with each step. My flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the floor, plunging the room into near darkness. Its final words rang in my ears as it loomed over me, its form stretching impossibly tall. "You'll never leave. You're ours now," I screamed as it lunged, and the door slammed shut behind me. The air inside room 107 pressed down on me like a weight, suffocating and absolute. The shadow loomed closer, its form shifting. Between grotesque shapes, faces stretched and melting, hands clawing toward me. My back hit the wall, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the whispers filling the room. "This place will never let you go," the voice rasped, thick with malice. "You're part of it now." The light from my flashlight flickered one last time, and then died, leaving me in utter darkness. I stumbled forward, hands outstretched, desperate to find the door. My fingers grazed the knob. It was ice cold, but when I pulled, it didn't budge. "You can't escape," the voice hissed from everywhere and nowhere. "They never do." I turned, expecting to face it, but the room was empty. Empty except for the mirror. In its surface, my reflection stared back. But it wasn't me. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a silent scream. Slowly, the reflection raised its hand and pressed it against the glass. I felt the same icy pressure on my chest, as though it were pulling me in. I screamed, yanking the door open with a strength I didn't know I had. Stumbling into the hallway, I collapsed, gasping for breath. But something was wrong. The motel wasn't the same. The hallway stretched endlessly, its once familiar walls now covered in warped, pulsing patterns. Doors lined both sides, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of impossibly dark rooms. Shadows oozed from within, pooling at my feet. I turned to look back at room 107, but the door was gone, just smooth wall where it had been. I ran, my footsteps echoing in the endless corridor. No matter how far I went, the shadows followed, stretching closer, whispering my name. My legs gave out, and I crumpled to the floor, tears streaming down my face. "I locked the door myself," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But now I can't find the key, and the shadows are still moving." When the morning staff arrived, the motel was empty. Room 107 was sealed, its door rusted shut, the number plate missing. But on the surveillance footage, they saw something. A figure standing motionless at the edge of the parking lot, staring into the camera. If you dare, share this story. But be warned, every retelling gives it strength. Do you feel safe as you read this? Or is something watching from the corner of your room? Are you sure you're alone right now? Or is something waiting for you to finish this story, just like it waited for me? The moment I stepped into the wedding hall, the chandeliers flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced like living creatures. A deafening silence followed, broken only by the synchronized creak of heads turning to face me. Their glowing yellow eyes pierced my soul, devoid of humanity, and yet they smiled. Somehow, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake by entering. I had been drifting through life like a ghost. Each day felt like an echo of the last. My apartment, a small, sterile box, offered no comfort, only four walls that seemed to close in a little tighter with every passing hour. The dim light of the street lamps outside barely filtered through the blinds, casting sickly shadows across my room. I'd just returned from another failed interview, another notch in my growing list of disappointments. My hands trembled as I removed my shoes, trying to shake off the exhaustion, but the weight of failure still clung to me. That's when I noticed it. A slip of paper on the floor, shoved under my door as though someone had left it there in passing. At first I thought it was a flyer or junk mail, but then I saw it. An envelope, smooth and pristine, unmarked, save for an elegant flourish of handwriting on the front. My name. I tore it open. My curiosity piqued. Inside was a wedding invitation. The edges of the paper were delicate, shimmering slightly in the dim light. You are invited to the wedding of Alexandra and Victor, it read. The name, though, meant nothing to me. I couldn't place them, couldn't recall anyone by those names, and certainly couldn't imagine why they'd be inviting me. My fingers trembled as I traced the words, the ink so perfect it seemed almost too deliberate, too precise. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this invitation didn't belong in my hands, but I couldn't stop staring at it. The elegance of the paper, the mystery of it all, it gnawed at something inside me, something deeper than I was ready to admit. I tried to rationalize it, but the unease lingered, gnawing at my mind. Why was I being invited? How did they know me? The fear that prickled my skin told me to throw it away, but instead I found myself holding on to it longer, turning it over in my hand, as if it held some secret I was meant to uncover. Maybe, I thought, this was the one thing I could hold on to, something out of the ordinary, a chance to be part of something real. Maybe it would give me a break from the crushing monotony of my life. And yet, the creeping unease grew stronger as I made my decision. I would go. The drive to the hall felt almost uneventful, just me, the highway, and the hum of the engine as I navigated through empty streets. But as I approached the outskirts of town, something changed. The air felt heavier. The clouds overhead were thick and oppressive, blocking out the sun entirely. The hall loomed ahead, its towering structure a silent monument that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, as though it had always been here, waiting. Its dark stone facade glistened in the dim light of the afternoon, untouched by time, and yet so out of place. The doors were wide open, inviting me in as though they had been expecting me all along. I hesitated for just a moment, standing in the shadow of the building, before something whispered in the back of my mind. It was too late to turn back. The door slammed shut behind me as soon as I stepped across the threshold, the noise startling in the silence. I froze, suddenly feeling as though I had walked into a trap. The air inside was cold, too cold for an empty building, and the silence was so thick it pressed against my eardrums. It was the kind of silence that suffocates, that makes you feel like you can't breathe, like something is waiting, just beyond reach. I looked around, but the hall was completely empty. Rows upon rows of chairs sat in perfect formation, yet no one was sitting in them. I took a few hesitant steps forward, the sound of my shoes echoing too loudly in the cavernous space. The faint hum of music reached my ears then, the soft strains of a classical melody I couldn't quite place. It floated through the air, surrounding me, yet I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It felt like a lullaby, but not a comforting one. It was the kind of melody that made your skin crawl, the kind that haunted your thoughts. And then I saw them. Staff members, moving silently around the hall. They seemed to be setting up, preparing for something, but they didn't look at me. Their movements were slow, robotic, mechanical. It was as if they weren't really human, just figments of the space. They didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't even spare a glance my way as they passed by. My throat tightened. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise, and the hairs on my arms prickled. I was being watched. I couldn't explain how, but I knew it. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I turned to leave, but the door wasn't there anymore. The path I had taken had disappeared. Instead, I found myself being drawn deeper into the hall, my feet moving of their own accord. I tried to fight it, but every time I tried to step back, I was pulled forward. An invisible force urging me onward. It was as if the hall itself had decided I wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. The first hint that something was wrong came slowly, as the guests began trickling in. At first, it was just a few of them silently, walking past me as though I was invisible. But they weren't right. Their faces were blurry, their features shifting like a mirage, as if they weren't quite real. It was a sensation I couldn't shake, like a half-remembered dream. Then, their eyes found mine. Cold. Empty. Their smiles were too wide, stretched unnaturally, as if they were hiding something or perhaps savoring it. I stood there, frozen, feeling the blood drain from my face. These weren't normal guests. They didn't seem to notice the awkwardness, the distance. Some of them walked past me like I didn't exist, while others, those who stopped, stared, unblinking, as though they could see right through me. Their gaze was too intense, their eyes too fixed. It was a look that felt like an invasion. Their smiles only grew colder as they studied me, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle in warning. I tried to look away, to focus on anything else, but every time I turned my head, there was someone else's eyes following me, their presence lingering in the air like a shadow. The room, once silent, now felt thick with tension. I felt more and more alone, surrounded by people who were supposed to be friendly but felt anything but. No one spoke to me. No one offered greetings. It was as if I had been left out of something I wasn't meant to understand. I tried to remind myself that it was just a wedding, that it was just nerves, playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore the unease that curled like smoke around my heart. The air was stifling, pressing against me from all sides. I wanted to leave, but it was as if I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, stuck in place by an invisible force. As I scanned the room, I realized something else. The walls didn't feel real anymore either. They seemed to be closing in on me, warping in and out of focus. The hallway behind me, a possible escape, was no longer visible. No matter where I looked, everything remained the same. The same guests, the same oppressive silence. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath shallow. The fear was mounting, and I couldn't find the source. Something wasn't just wrong, it was off in a way I couldn't explain. This wasn't a wedding. This was something else entirely. The ceremony started without warning, as if it had always been meant to happen. I didn't want to watch, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak. The bride and groom were standing at the altar now, perfectly still. There was something too perfect about them. Their faces, unreal, flawless, reminded me of dolls, smooth and expressionless. But the worst part? Their eyes. Black, hollow, empty. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as the bride's gaze locked onto mine. Her gown shimmered unnaturally, as though it had a life of its own, undulating in the low light of the hall. It was unsettling, no fabric. Should move like that, should breathe like that. The groom, standing beside her, spoke. But it wasn't his voice. It was low, guttural, and unnatural sound that rattled deep within my chest. The words he spoke didn't make sense at first, but then it hit me. They were directed at me. They weren't vows to each other. They were for me. The moment stretched, and I couldn't look away. My body refused to move, my limbs frozen in place. I couldn't even blink. It felt like the air was thickening, suffocating me, as if the very room was alive, wrapping around me, pressing me further into the cold, hard floor. The words, the gaze, the presence of these two figures, their existence felt wrong. A wave of panic swept over me, but there was nowhere to run. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every beat echoing in my ears. The room grew colder, darker. The walls felt like they were caving in, slowly, as if the space was shrinking around me. I wanted to scream, to yell, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped by the force of whatever was controlling this nightmare, this wedding. The bride's eyes never left mine. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. My own breath came in ragged gasps, but it felt like the air was being stolen from me. I was suffocating, but I couldn't fight it. Not anymore. I was powerless, caught in the gaze of these two monstrous figures. The ceremony was a farce. The vows, my vows, were a dark incantation. And then, with a sudden movement, the groom kissed the bride. The world tilted. The kiss was the breaking point. As their lips met, I felt the entire room shift beneath me. The ground trembled, as if the hall itself was alive, groaning under some unseen weight. The walls began to bleed black liquid, thick and slick, oozing from the cracks that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It poured down the walls in slow, creeping rivulets, dark as night and as cold as death. I gasped, my mind unable to process what was happening. And then the lights flickered. First once, then again, and finally the entire room was plunged into darkness, save for a few sickly, flickering bulbs above. But even in the dim light, I could see them, the guests, every single one of them. Their eyes, now all turned toward me, gleamed with an unnatural hunger. The smiles on their faces had twisted into something far more sinister, their teeth, now too sharp, their expressions too knowing. I tried to scream, but my mouth was dry. No sound came out. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but the walls pressed closer, the space around me shrinking tighter with each passing second. I staggered back, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. My chest was heavy, as though the air itself had turned into lead. The guests circled me, closing in. I tried to back away, but every direction led me back to them, every step taken only bringing me deeper into their web. The air was thick with a hum now, a deep vibration that pulsed through my chest, making my teeth ache. The ground beneath me shook again, violently this time. I fell to my knees, the cold marble floor biting into my skin. My hands pressed to the ground, as if searching for something solid, something real. But there was nothing, only the blackness creeping along the edges of the room, only the low, guttural chant that had started again, this time from the guests themselves. Their voices, a chorus of whispers, filled the room, and I realized with sickening clarity this wasn't just a wedding. It was my wedding, and I wasn't a guest. I was the offerings. The walls closed in around me, not physically but mentally. I could no longer deny it, this place wasn't real. The people here weren't real. It was all a grotesque mockery of life, a twisted dimension caught somewhere between the living and the dead, existing in a space where time bent and broke. The guests were not there by accident, they were prisoners, just like me, bound to this place by a force I couldn't comprehend. I had watched the bride and groom, the ones orchestrating this nightmare. They weren't simply figures in a ceremony, they were its architects, pulling the strings of every moment, every breath. They controlled the hall, controlled us all. The whole place thrived on fear, feeding off it like a parasite, and I, just like everyone else here, was nothing more than food for it. A sudden, violent tremor ran through the ground beneath my feet. I stumbled forward, catching myself against one of the walls as the shaking grew more intense. It felt like the building itself was breathing, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of some ancient, malevolent force. It was then that I realized there was no way out. Not anymore. This place had a hold on me, on all of us. It had taken something from me, something I couldn't name, and now it was consuming me whole. The door I had thought was an escape had vanished, leaving me with nothing but the same claustrophobic space to wander in. Circles. My heart raced as I spun, looking for a way out, but all I saw was the same cold marble, the same lifeless faces of the guests, who stared at me, unmoving, unblinking. And then it hit me, the guests weren't trapped like I was. They were the ones who had trapped me. They were echoes of those who they had come before me, forever cursed to repeat this cycle, and now I had become one of them. My body, my soul, it was all slipping away. There was no fighting it. I wasn't a visitor here. I was part of the hall, a soul trapped in its eternal loop. The realization spread through me like a disease, and I couldn't fight it. I could feel my mind fraying at the edges, my thoughts scattering. My memories were already starting to fade, as if they were being erased by the very air I breathed. I was losing myself, and it was only a matter of time before I would become like them, a hollow shell, unable to remember who I was or what I once meant. There was no escape, no turning back. I had become one with the horror. I had become the horror. I stumbled, my legs weak beneath me. My thoughts were jumbled, disjointed, like trying to hold onto a dream that slipped away with every passing second. My chest was tight, and my breath came in shallow, panicked bursts. I had thought I had reached the end, that the nightmare was finally over. But as I approached the altar, I saw her. A woman entered, her steps slow and measured, and for a moment I thought it was her. My ex-wife, the woman I had loved, the woman I had lost. A wave of emotion hit me, overwhelming in its intensity. Could this be my chance to escape? Was she here to save me? Had I somehow been pulled from the nightmare and returned to the real world? But then she turned to face me, and my heart stopped. Her eyes locked onto mine, and there was a gleam in them, something I couldn't quite place, but something cold, something familiar in the worst way. Her smile curled at the corners of her lips, a knowing smile, a dangerous smile. That was when I realized she wasn't here to save me. She wasn't even human, not anymore. Her face was too perfect, her movements too fluid, too practiced. She was like the others, one of the lost souls, pulled into the hall and made part of its eternal cycle. She had come before me, she had been waiting for me, and now I was part of the cycle too. I took a step back, my mind reeling, trying to grasp at some thread of reality, but it was slipping through my fingers, vanishing into the shadows of this twisted place. I could hear the whispers of the guests around me, growing louder, their voices in eerie chorus that seemed to mock my attempts at understanding. The bride, my bride, wasn't the woman I had once known. She was just another part of this nightmare, another puppet in the hands of whatever force controlled the hall. I realized then, with sickening clarity, that I wasn't trapped in the hall. I was the hall. This was my fate. I had become a part of the endless cycle, trapped in an eternal loop, forever watching the same ceremony unfold, over and over again. The bride, the guests, the hall, they were all mine now, as I was theirs. The cycle was endless, and I was lost in it, forever. The world around me had dissolved into a nightmare, and with it, every ounce of hope. I realized, in the pit of my stomach, that I had never truly left. The wedding hall, the guests, the bride and groom, they were all part of the trap, part of the cycle that would never end. I had walked into this place, thinking I could escape it, but now I understood. There was no escape. There had never been a way out. The hall had claimed me, just like it had claimed every soul before me. and every soul that would come after. I was nothing more than a whisper now, a shadow in the endless void, forever bound to this place. I tried to scream, to fight, but my body refused to obey. My mind, too, was fading, slipping into the fog that had taken hold of everyone else. The walls, once cold and imposing, now seemed to pulse with life, breathing in time with my own panicked heart. The darkness closed in on me, pressing against my chest as if it wanted to swallow me whole. The faces of the guests, the ones who had been watching me all this time, began to blur, their features melting into one grotesque mass. Their eyes, hollow and black, stared at me, without mercy, waiting for the final moment when I, too, would become nothing. And then, just as everything began to fade, just as I thought I had lost everything, there was a sound. A whisper. A low, guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but I felt its words pierce the depths of my soul. "You're not alone. Not yet." The words echoed in my mind, their meaning twisting in the darkness. It was as if the hall, the very thing that had consumed me, was speaking directly to me. Was this it? Was I to be forever trapped, lost in the loop with no end? Or was something else waiting? Something even darker, more insidious than I could imagine. I wanted to run, to escape, but the space around me had become too vast, too unfamiliar. My legs no longer worked. My hands, once trembling in fear, were now motionless. I was becoming a part of it, a piece of the never-ending nightmare that would haunt the world forever. And then, just as the blackness swallowed me entirely, I felt a cold hand brush against my own, a gentle reminder that I was never truly alone. Not even now. Are you sure you're alone? As you finish this story, think about the shadows around you. Are they empty, or is something waiting, listening, just beyond your sight? Remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality.